I'm George Curtis. Welcome to It's Your Law. Each week it's my privilege to bring guests that teach all of us about some segment of the law. How the law is made, how it's enforced, how it's supposed to work, and how it sometimes doesn't work, and what you as citizens can do about it. I try to bring interesting guests who have some special knowledge that most of us don't have, or want to make a difference now, and they want your approval. They want to be elected. That's the kind of a guest I have today. We have a Supreme Court race coming up very shortly. I think there's a primary about the 20th of February, and then shortly after that in April is probably the final for the last two people that survived the primary. It's my pleasure today to have one of the candidates for Supreme Court of the state of Wisconsin as our guest. His name is Tim Burns. Welcome to the show.
George, thanks so much for inviting me.
I'm delighted to invite you. I've been following the campaign in the newspaper, and some of your people have been calling me, and they're really pests, which is how how we win elections.
Yes, it's the burden of democracy.
That's right. I don't think democracy is supposed to be comfortable.
No, but, it isn't.
Tell me a little bit about your background so that people know what they're voting for or against for Supreme Court.
Sure. George, I have an unusual background for a Supreme Court justice. I'm actually the grandson of Mississippi sharecroppers. And my father was forced out of school by poverty in the 5th grade, my mother in the 10th grade. But I was fortunate. My father went in the Army. I grew up as an Army brat, and I grew up after folks like you and your parents and a lot of people around this country, a lot of workers had built the greatest middle class in the history of the planet. And we had great public schools and great public libraries, and I could work hard and dream and become what I wanted to be, which was one of the best lawyers in the country at suing insurance companies. And so that's what I've been doing for the last 25 or 26 years.
Why does it give you a pleasure to sue insurance companies? Something I've done for 55 years myself.
You know, when ancestrally you're from the hill country of Mississippi, the pine forests of Mississippi, you're a natural populace. And so for populace, insurance companies have always been the bad guys. And so it's been good to have a career where I've stood up to them.
Well, insurance companies, of course, have a role in this country, but
absolutely.
They have so much money and so much power that they have really gotten control through elections of the legislatures in almost every state, the governorships recently, the Congress. They've contributed heavily to the presidency, and very recently in a so-called tax reform, President Trump gave them a big wet kiss in a tax break, didn't they?
It's as gross as it sounds. And so, look, it's a problem that our grandparents and great-grandparents understood well. Giant corporations threaten our democracy because they end up governing instead of we, the people, governing. And we've gone sort of back to the past now in our country. That I was last night before bed, I was sitting down and reading one of the biographies by Nancy Unger of Bob La Follette, Fighting Bob La Follette. And it was talking about his election to the governor's mansion in 1900. And they said, when talking about him, that at that time, 1% of our population in Wisconsin owned 50% of the property. Sound familiar?
It certainly does. Let me ask you this. Can you take a minute and tell the folks that are watching this show about your specific education and experience and why you've decided to run for office? This is your first shot at running for office, isn't it?
It is my first shot at running for office. So, that same middle class opportunity gave me our economy gave me the opportunity to go to law school. On a full scholarship, which was important to me because my family didn't have a lot, and I didn't have a lot. And went to law school. I did well. I was one of the handful of graduating young lawyers who was a law clerk on our United States Court of Appeals. After that, I've worked at a number of law firms in a number of places. I've worked at some of our largest law firms as a partner in some of our large Chicago and San Francisco-based law firms. But I've also been a lawyer in a small town, an 8-person, and I've handled divorces and leaky basement cases and wills. But I've also handled some of the biggest insurance disputes out there. I have a real broad and varied practice. And I knew that what I brought to the table right now was the most important thing to have on the Supreme Court in this day and age. We have a Supreme Court that hasn't stood up to special interests and big business. And I've spent a career standing up to big business. I've also counseled many of the boards of directors of many of our top corporations in the country. I know American business. I know what American business does well. But I know when American business oversteps and how important it is to make sure that courts focus on helping regular people and making sure they have a fair playing field, not just focus on big business and special interests.
The only thing that the people still have, in my opinion, is the ballot box and the jury box. Everything else has been sold to big money. We have to take our first break, and when we come back, I want you to comment on that and move on. We'll be right back. Welcome back to It's Your Law. Tim Burns and I are talking about the Supreme Court. He's running for the Supreme Court. Now, if he wins, he's going to be one member of the Supreme Court, and yet Tim feels very strongly that he's going to make a difference in terms of taking away the bedfellow approach of the Supreme Court in the state of Wisconsin with the governor's office, and that he is going to make a difference in terms of the Supreme Court no longer just being the guard dog for big business and insurance interests. Those are big hills to climb. Tell us how you're going to do that.
They are big hills to climb, and it requires more than me. It requires all of us. But I want to give people hope that it can be done. That we saw last night in Senate District 10, Patty Shatner win a district that Donald Trump had won by 17 points last November, and she won by 9 points running as a Democrat. A blue wave is coming in the state, and it's started last night, and it's going to continue with my election this spring. I will be only one of 7 justices. There are currently two progressive judges on the court right now, and I will join, and it will be 3 progressives, and there will be 4 conservatives who have served as the rubber stamp of Scott Walker. So what do you do to change the court? 2 more elections in 2019. Justice Abramson will be up for election, and we will catapult from my victory to her victory. And then in 2020, one of the conservatives, Justice Kelly, will be up for election the same day as the presidential primary. We will take back this court by the spring of 2020.
But big business manages to fuel $1 million to almost every Supreme Court election. This tidal wave of money, you've got a great message, but how can your canoe paddle of the truth turn back the tidal wave?
So there's been only one way in this country, George, in our history, that we've been able to turn back concentrated wealth and retake our government. And that's when the Democrats and the protest progressives come together, join forces, and take back their government. They use their loud voices in speech to fight back against the forces of concentrated wealth. And that's what's going to happen this spring. And let me give you an example. There are a lot of traditional Democrats supporting me in this race. I've been endorsed by Congressman Mark Pocan, Congressman Steve Kagan, Tom Nelson, Senator Jennifer Schilling, the head of the Senate Democrats, Joanne Kloppenberg, who ran for this position the last two times, has endorsed my campaign, Lieutenant Governor Barbara Lawton, Ed Fallone. So I have the support of the voices of traditional Democrats, but last week I also was one of 5 candidates this year to receive the National Our Revolution endorsement. That's the Bernie Sanders organization, our biggest, strongest progressive grassroots organizations at the moment. And so those two forces are behind me. We will retake this court.
Well, I hope that that is absolutely correct. I want the people to take over the court, the legislature, and the governorship. But at the same time, elections, especially these nonpartisan spring elections, are decided by the people who stay home. What are we going to do for them?
Well, it is a large part of the reason why I have been running a different campaign than has been run before in the state. I have been utterly candid about my political values and my legal values, because the only way we get people to come out to vote is by giving them something to vote for. We've been running elections in the past, largely talking about people's resume and about people being fair and impartial. And we've had great candidates, but that type of message doesn't compete with the hardcore political message that the Republicans have been going with. But my message, which I believe deeply, is the type of political message that will compete with the Republicans' message. The Republicans have had essentially one message, maybe one and a half in these Supreme Court races. The first message is, this guy is going to be soft on crime. And the other ones, he's legislating from the bench. And talking about your professional resume doesn't compete with that. Talking about being fair and impartial doesn't compete with it. But when you have a guy like me saying at the top of his lungs, look, don't talk to us about soft on crime. The Koch brothers and Wisconsin's Manufacturing and Commerce, who are paying for your attack ads, don't care about crime in our community. They care about tilting the economic playing field in their favor, and enough is enough. That's the kind of message that actually is true and actually wins the day.
You're saying it's supposed to be a democracy, not an oligarchy.
Exactly. That's what a number of revolutionaries fought for almost 250 years ago today. That's the country we inherited. That's the country we have to get back.
Well said, Tim Burns. We're out of
George.
time. Welcome anytime. And thanks for being on the show.
Thank you very much. Good to see you.
It's been said that we have the government we deserve because we're supposed to be in control of this government. The decisions as to who represents us in the legislature, the executive branch, or the court are largely made by people who vote thoughtlessly or don't vote at all. There's a real shortage of people who think of the ramifications of their vote and whether or not they should just rubber stamp a certain party that their father or their grandfather voted for. Whether they should continue to support the people who have put rich corporations in charge so rich corporations benefit from tax breaks and more control at the expense of working people. I don't tell anybody who to vote for. That's why they call it a secret ballot. But I'm more comfortable voting for somebody like Tim Burns, myself, who we know has the guts to sue insurance companies and large corporations. That's one step toward making this a democracy. We used to be a democracy, government of the people, instead of government of the dollar. That's my thought. I'm George Curtis.